This GeographyBurst video focuses on solutions to climate change. You should use pages 46 to 49 of your textbook to support this video. We'll be looking at two elements in our solutions to climate change. First of all, mitigation, which means the reduction of the causes of climate change. And secondly, how we can reduce the effects, the solutions that we as humans have come up with to cope with the effects that climate change may bring in the future. First of all, how can climate change be managed? We will look at three different scales to see how this can come into effect. The local scale is what we as individuals, communities, or regions within a country can do. Perhaps the most obvious scheme of the scale is recycling. Many different materials can now be recycled, including plastic, metal, paper and cardboard, glass, food waste, depending on council restrictions, of course. As well as this, many councils are now reducing the size of their general rubbish bins. This is in order to reduce the waste that goes to landfill. Recycling and reducing waste going to landfill is beneficial in reducing the levels of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, because when waste in landfill decomposes, it forms methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas approximately 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat. Recycling also means that less energy is used to produce new products, which would, in doing so, produce more greenhouse gas. Also on the local scale is public transport. Making public transport more appealing can also be beneficial in reducing the causes of climate change. Less cars on the road, of course, means less carbon emissions, as well as less congestion. Things like bus lanes and bus passes to encourage public transport have been effective. Priority bus lanes also would speed up journey times, so it's beneficial to those people who are using it instead of their cars. Similar schemes could also be used for trains and trams, especially in urban areas where congestion and pollution from cars is a large problem. The national scale is about what countries can do to reduce the causes of climate change. 87% of human carbon emissions comes from the burning of fossil fuels, mostly to generate energy. So it's no surprise that many countries are turning to alternative energy sources, such as hydroelectricity, nuclear power, solar power, wind power, and tidal power. Alternative fuels have many benefits. They, of course, do not emit large amounts of carbon dioxide. Most are renewable, so will last a lot longer into the future than fossil fuels, which will eventually run out when they have been all burnt away. The UK, for instance, is aiming to have 15% of its energy from renewable sources by the year 2020. Carbon capture is also a national level scheme to reduce the causes of climate change. Carbon capture, or CCS as it's often shortened to, uses technology to capture carbon dioxide. It's possible to capture almost 90% of carbon dioxide that would enter the atmosphere otherwise. The gas is collected, compressed, and injected as a liquid into suitable locations beneath the ground where it's safely stored and won't act as a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Planting trees is also a well-established initiative across many countries throughout the world. Trees naturally absorb carbon dioxide by photosynthesis, which makes them a natural carbon sink. So the more trees there are, the less carbon dioxide there will be in the atmosphere. Not only that, but plantation forests planted in specific ways are actually more effective at absorbing carbon dioxide and can absorb faster than natural forests. And thirdly, on the international scale, climate change is undoubtedly one of the greatest issues that the global community faces because it affects everybody in every country. Therefore, international agreements between many nations across the globe require cooperation to reach a common goal of reducing carbon emissions. The Kyoto Protocol was the first landmark treaty, which was signed by over 170 countries, and in doing so they pledged to reduce carbon emissions by 5.2% below the levels of 1990 by the year 2012. It was hailed as many by a success, but unfortunately, the United States and Australia, two of the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitters, refused to sign the treaty as they believed it was unfair. A few years later, we have the Copenhagen Accord of 2009. World leaders again met in the Danish capital in this year to discuss climate change and how to tackle it beyond 2012, which was what the Kyoto Protocol agreed up to. This agreement also targeted reducing climate change, but also pledged financial support to low-income countries across the world to help them deal with the impacts of climate change. However, there was no legally binding agreement to the accord. And the third landmark international agreement was the Paris Agreement of 2015. This involved 195 countries from around the world signing the first ever universal and legally binding global climate deal. Its points included to keep the global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius and limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level when humans started to fill the atmosphere with greenhouse gas. To achieve a balance between the numbers of sources of carbon and the sinks of carbon in the second half of this century, and to give $100 billion per year to support efforts in low-income countries to support climate change initiatives. However, again, it was criticised for making a lot of promises but no real firm commitments. So this brings us to the second half of our video. How can we as humans adapt to climate change? Some of the strategies that have been put in place across the world that we will look at are managing water supplies, managing rising sea levels, and the changes that will have to be put in place to agriculture or farming. Firstly, managing water supplies. Droughts and floods are already happening more frequently. Droughts, of course, when there is not enough water, and floods when there is too much water. They will only become more frequent in the future. So managing what water is used for and the efficiency with which water is used, it will be crucial in the future. Currently, millions of people in South Asia, in countries like India and Bangladesh, depend on water from melting snow and ice in the Himalayas. However, as glaciers are shrinking year by year, they have an unsecure water supply. So one of the projects that's put in place to combat this problem is the artificial glacier projects, which is where water is collected during the winter when the availability is better and it's deliberately frozen. When it melts in the spring, it provides another water source as well as what they get from the glaciers that are shrinking. Rising sea levels are a huge problem for many low-lying countries across the world. By the year 2100, sea levels may have risen as much as 82 centimetres higher than they are today. Some of the countries that would be devastated are Bangladesh, the Netherlands, and the Maldives. For instance, in the Maldives, they've already started to plan for this possibility in building a 3-metre high seawall around parts of the islands, by building certain buildings on stilts raised above the sea, and by replanting coastal mangroves which act as a natural barrier for protection during storms. They've even explored the idea of relocating every single person in the Maldives to Sri Lanka or India. And finally, changes to agriculture or farming. Farming across the globe in the future will change as temperatures increase and droughts and floods become more common. This will make it more difficult for some regions to grow crops, and others may be forced to grow different crops. For instance, in the UK, we may see increased yields of crops such as tomatoes or vine crops. Some adaptations to the way that crops are grown and the types of crops that are grown include drought-resistant crops that can withstand longer times without water, education of farmers and how to get the best practice and yield the best crop results, new cropping patterns such as changing the planting dates of certain crops so the soil doesn't become exhausted, new irrigation or watering systems to maximize the efficiency and not waste water, and even planting trees among the crops to provide shade so that plants don't become dehydrated. Geography. Know your world.